Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today we are going to be talking about the fourth and final King in Yellow story from the four stories that mention the King in Yellow in Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow. And this story is called The Yellow Sign. Again, if you want information about Robert W. Chambers or the publication of this book, go back to the video about the Repairer of Reputations, which is where I broke all that down. Originally, I was just going to do a video talking about just this book in one video, and it would have been 5 hours long. So I'm breaking it up story by story in order to really go into depth about these stories, which I like to do. Also, the King in Yellow section ends after this story. The Yellow Sign is the last King in Yellow story. So much so that the recent Penguin reissue, Penguin did this interesting weird fiction re-release of a bunch of kind of rarer books. Outlaw Bookseller talks a lot about them in a couple of his recent videos. I'll link the video below. But Penguin, when they did the King in Yellow, only included the four King in Yellow stories in the re-release. They didn't include the other ones, which kind of makes sense to me, because since the first four stories in this volume are linked, as a reader, I very much want all of them to link in kind of a fix-up novel sort of way, like The Illustrated Man, right? Where you always come back to this framing story. And this one is all framed by the King in Yellow. But it really is only the first 104 pages that are King in Yellow related. It's not bad, however. There's a couple other horror stories in here that I am going to go over. I'm not going to stop with just this one. There's a prose poem story, like just a bunch of linked prose poems. I don't know how much I'll go in about that one, although I did very much enjoy reading it. And then there's two horror stories or weird fiction stories that don't have anything to do with the King in Yellow, but are really cool and I feel like fit into the same atmosphere as these other four. And then there's three romance stories after that are not horror at all, have no link to the King in Yellow, and I will be, I'm going to forego discussing those. We don't need to talk about those. They don't really fit the channel, so. And I know he was extremely popular as a romance author in his time, but I'm not 100% taken with his romances. They are very much of their time, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not what I'm interested in. So, yeah. All right, let's jump into The Yellow Sign. This is a lot of people's favorite of the four, and I can understand why. It's a really good story. For me, it would be third. I put The Mask and The Repairer of Reputations above this one, although I don't know in which order I put The Mask and The Repairer of Reputations. And then this one will be third. And then the one I did before, which is called In the Court of the Dragon, I put fourth. What's cool about this one is this is the story that links characters together, which is very, very cool. So in The Mask, our main character was Alec, and he was taken care of by Jack Scott, a painter. And now in this story, we get to hear what happened to Jack Scott, the painter. So Jack Scott has a studio across the street from an old Catholic church, and he's Catholic, but this church, he notices, has a night watchman that really bugs him. And the way he describes it is he's kind of overweight and very pale, and to Jack he seems like a funeral worm. I think a grave worm is what he calls him. He looks like a grave worm. And so he's painting one day, and he walks over to the window and sees this guy while they're taking a break. And he has a model there named Tessie, a nude model. He looks at this guy, and it really throws him off. And he's like, oh, that's weird. And he goes back to his painting. And suddenly, as he's painting, the paint he's laying down starts to look decrepit, and the skin of the model that he's painting starts to look kind of yellow, and he starts trying to scrape it off, and the model comes over and she's like, dude, does my skin look like that? And he's like, no, I don't know what's going on. It must be bad paint or bad paint remover. And she's like, well, I noticed that you went and looked out the window and told me about the guy that looked like a worm. He told his model. And ever since then, you've been having problem painting. And he says, yeah, maybe he bewitched me. And he freaks out and destroys the painting. And his model Tessie's like, well, that was ridiculous. And he feels bad for doing that. And they talk, and she says, it's interesting about the night watchman out there, because I had a dream and you were in it. She relates this dream that she was standing at her window and a hearse drove by, and in the hearse was a coffin. And in the coffin was Jack Scott. And the hearse driver was the night watchman. So he kind of laughs this off, and she goes home for the day. And the next morning, Thomas the bellboy comes up, and he has a conversation with Thomas. Thomas tells his story of the night watchman. And Thomas was out with a couple of friends, and they were walking by the church, and the night watchman was staring at him, and he also noticed that the night watchman is constantly staring hatefully at Jack Scott. So he's not a big fan of this guy anyway. But anyway, the guy's staring at him, and he starts yelling at him and says, what are you looking at? And basically, you want to start a fight. And he opens the gate and goes in and punches him. And Jack says, okay, what happened after that? And he says, well, I ran. And he said, I'm no coward. And you can tell that it hurts his pride to say this. But he says, I ran. Jack's like, okay, but why? And so finally this guy admits that when he was going to punch him, that the night watchman grabbed his hand. And he, in turn, squeezed the night watchman's hand. As he was squeezing, one of the night watchman's fingers came off in his hand. Just popped off. I love this image. This is so creepy. This is, I mean, for straight out creep, I think this is up there with the Repairer of Reputations. So Thomas the bellboy goes away, and Jack Scott is looking down at the night watchman, and he notices that one of the fingers on his hand is missing. So now we get into a point of this story that wasn't my absolute favorite. It lagged slightly, which is why I put this one in third. But there's a romance blooming between Jack and this model of his. And it starts with him talking about how innocent she is, and how worldly he is. And he hopes that as she grows up, she won't get too jaded or try to become too cool, that she'll keep this kind of innocence, and she's the best model he's ever had. And you can tell that he has feelings for her, but he's really keeping it to himself, trying to keep it professional. And the next day, or that afternoon after Thomas leaves, he tells her of a dream he had. And he had this dream where he was riding in a coffin, and there was a glass section in the coffin that he could see through, and then he could see through the windows of the hearse, and was able to see her standing and staring through her window at him. And this freaks her out, and she starts crying, and he puts his arms around her, and she admits her feelings for him, and he kisses her. So she leaves, and he takes a walk and is mulling over this awful thing he did in kissing her, and is like, okay, now I have to marry her, or I'm going to end up hurting her, and I don't want to hurt that innocence that she has. And he's simultaneously, it seems like annoyed with her and madly in love with her. And I believe that this is absolutely of its time. That people who read this in 1895 were probably like, that's exactly how relationships are. And they would like this weird, almost fatherly affection towards innocence that he has with her. And I mean, that's not even the reason I don't like it. It just doesn't. I don't find this offensive. I read tons of romances going Victorian era and further back. Of course, there's gender stereotypes that people are going to fit in depending on what era you're reading from, what those will look like. This is just one era that does not really work for me. I didn't find their relationship cute or funny in any way. It seemed really weird. And he was trying, and of course he's trying to compare and contrast these two. She's the innocent and he is the bohemian that's already lived this wild lifestyle. He talks about a woman named Sylvia, and I at one point I thought he was already married. I couldn't really even tell. The vagueness was so layered. And honestly, I appreciated the spooky parts a little bit more. So he takes this walk, and then he goes out with another lady, Edith Carmichael, I think was her name. And afterwards, he's walking home, and he has to walk past the church, and the night watchman is there. And he's kind of nervous and trying to get past him quickly. And as he walks past him, the night watchman says something to him. And when he's home, he ruminates over this, and what the night watchman has said to him is, "Have you found the yellow sign?" And he goes over that in his head over and over again. And the next morning, he goes to go to work, and Tessie is there, except for he can't find his painting he was working on. And slowly he begins to realize that because they have fallen in love, she can no longer pose nude for him. And he drops in this metaphor of they'd eaten the fruit of knowledge. So we get this Adam and Eve concept that they are suddenly aware of their nakedness. And it was a cool turn. I liked it. It was a cool literary turn. I enjoyed the metaphor and the connection, and I think that Chambers handled it well. He's a good writer. But again, I wasn't as interested, and that's probably just me. It's as far as romances go, this was not the best because of his constant annoyance with her. It made it very strange for me. She gives him a piece of jewelry with a weird scribble on it. And again, he's super annoyed with her, but he decides he's going to take it anyway. And I think we're supposed to understand that he really does love her and he's really happy to get this, but he can't think like that. I don't know what's going on. It has this really weird symbol on it. And he's like, "Why would you buy this for me?" And she's like, "I didn't buy it. I found this. I reported it in the newspaper. Nobody's ever came to claim it. I found it. So it's the most expensive thing I have. So I want you to have it." And she tells him, "Yeah, I found it walking one day. In fact, it was the day after I had the first dream of the hearse." So the spookiness is back, which makes me very happy. A little later, he sprains his wrists. He falls and sprains his wrists, and so he can't work. So they're bored around the house, and he goes through his library trying to find a book to read, and he sees this weird book that's bound in snakeskin, and he's like, "I don't remember that book," and he has her pull it down, and it's The King in Yellow. And we get some really interesting things going on right here. First off, he is vehemently against reading The King in Yellow. In fact, he doesn't even know how it got into his library. And let me read this quote really quick. It's very short. "If I ever had any curiosity to read it, the awful tragedy of young Castaigne, whom I knew, prevented me from exploring its wicked pages." So he knew Hildred Castaigne is my guess, or Louis Castaigne. I'm not probably Hildred, because that's the tragedy. He knew him, probably before he came to Paris to live his bohemian lifestyle. I assume he knew him in America. This story takes place in America, and sorry, I'm just kind of putting all these threads together myself. I've read each of these stories 2 times, and I'm still finding stuff. The reason that I'm assuming that this narrator is Jack Scott, who was from the story The Mask, is because Tessie calls this painter Mr. Scott. That's the only time we hear his name. She calls him Mr. Scott, and he's a painter, and Jack Scott in The Mask was also a painter. So I feel like there's more link to this than a lot of people talk about. I think this is Jack Scott. I don't see why he'd call one person in America Mr. Scott and another person, an American visiting Paris, Jack Scott. So this must just be when he came back to America later, is all I can guess. So The Mask is connected to the Yellow Sign by having the same character, Jack Scott, in my opinion. And the evidence for that is that he's called Mr. Scott in the American one and Jack Scott in the Paris one, and he's a painter in both of them. And Mr. Scott in the Yellow Sign knows young Castaigne, who was the Hildred in the first one, Repairer of Reputations. I do believe that Robert Chambers was trying to link all these stories together, and I think they do link in that way. Okay, sorry for that aside. I had to figure out my thoughts on all these links. Tessie pulls down the King in Yellow. He finds out it's the King in Yellow. He freaks out. Her curiosity is piqued, and she starts playfully running from him. And he runs following her, telling her not to open that book. And she hides from him. And he looks through the house, and she hides really well. And when he finds her later, she's obviously read the book. And she's pale and obviously quite devastated from reading this book. So she goes and lays down. And he's guessing sleeps, but he can't tell if she's sleeping. So he goes in. And Chambers doesn't really point out why, but I feel like this is really truly in this love story the most loving aspect. He goes and he reads this play, even though he's seen it destroy friends and knows specifically Castaigne, who he knew, and knows that it will send him insane. He reads it anyway, and I feel like he does that out of solidarity with her, which is pretty beautiful. But I love the way this is described, because he finishes reading it and he hears this monotone sound and realizes that it's he and Tessie talking about Carcosa and the King in Yellow. Really, really amazing moment. I'm going to read a section of this. We had been speaking for some time in a dull, monotonous strain before I realized that we were discussing the King in Yellow. Oh, the sin of writing such words which are clear as crystal, liquid and musical as bubbling springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisoned diamonds of the Medicis. Oh, the wickedness, the hopeless damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyze human creatures with such words, words understood by the ignorant and the wise alike, words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than music, more awful than death. I like how much Robert W. Chambers is interested in the concept of art and being an artist, and the idea. And I wonder, when I think of the genesis of this idea, Robert Chambers having this idea, of course I'm just making this up. I haven't found any interview or anything where he talks about how he made this up, but for some odd reason, I feel like at first it was this very positive thing where he thought, what if you could make like the most honest, beautiful piece of art? And then as he thought about it more and more, he thought it would be horrible and horrific and it would destroy people's lives. And I really I love that. I love the way that he looks at art and what it means to be an artist. It's just beautifully done. Uh, some of the best prose. I mean, really, truly. There's great prose all throughout this, but when he gets going about Carcosa and the King in Yellow, his prose just goes glacial and expands, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I really love it. So now that they've both read it, they realize that I think they call it a clasp, the piece of jewelry that Tessie gave him is the yellow sign, and she very much wants him to get rid of it, but he feels like he can't get rid of it. And then they hear a car, wouldn't be a car back then, never mind. Then they hear wheels on the cobblestone, and he goes out and he sees the hearse. It's funny, I always picture cars in this because it's the 20s, but it was written in 1895, and there's a part in one of the other stories where he gets a cab that's drawn by horses. So I have to imagine these being horse drawn, but I can't because it's in the future in the 20s. The hearse pulls up, and the night watchman gets out, and he's coming down the hallway. So Jack bolts the doors, and the hearse driver rots the bolts just by touching them and coming in. The bolts rot away, and Jack Scott is frozen in the middle of the room, terrified, and it's pure dark in the room. And suddenly he feels the night watchman's arms around him, and he's struggling with him, but it's like struggling against jello. It's impossible. And then the yellow sign is ripped away from him, and he hears Tessie die, and the yellow sign taken from him. And I'm going to just read the end of this story because it's absolutely incredible. I did not see him. It was only when I felt him envelop me in his cold, soft grasp that I cried out and struggled with deadly fury. But my hands were useless, and he tore the onyx clasp from my coat and struck me full in the face. Then, as I fell, I heard Tessie's soft cry, and her spirit fled. And even while falling, I longed to follow her, for I knew that the King in Yellow had opened his tattered mantle, and there was only God to cry to now. I could tell more, but I cannot see what help it will be to the world. As for me, I am past human help or hope. As I lie here writing, careless even whether or not I die before I finish, I can see the doctor gathering up his powders and phials with a vague gesture to the good priest beside me, which I understand. They will be very curious to know the tragedy, they of the outside world who write books and print millions of newspapers. But I shall write no more, and the Father Confessor will seal my last words with the seal of sanctity when his holy office is done. They of the outside world may send their creatures into wretched homes and death-smitten firesides, and their newspapers will batten on blood and tears, but with me their spies must halt before the confessional. They know that Tessie is dead and that I am dying. They know how the people in the house, aroused by an infernal scream, rushed into my room and found one living and two dead. But they do not know what I shall tell them now. They do not know that the doctor said, as he pointed to a horrible, decomposed heap on the floor, the livid corpse of the watchman from the church. I have no theory, no explanation. That man must have been dead for months. And then the last line, I think I am dying, I wish the priest would, and he cuts off. And that's the end of the 4 stories that Robert Chambers wrote about the King in Yellow. And they're absolutely incredible, and they're very mysterious. And we talked about mystery when we did the Repair of Reputations, but I keep going back to that concept. And what I can see is how obviously this would inspire somebody, because it is just vague enough to make you want to understand the King in Yellow even more. And I think that's what made Lovecraft want to include the King in Yellow and Hastur and some of these others into his pantheon, because that mystery is so good. And I can even take it a step further than that. Of course, most of you, I'm sure, have seen this, and many of you have already commented on it. And that's season 1 of True Detective, which uses the same mythology in the story, and it's incredible. It's really, really well done. In fact, I would say that it's an homage to these stories and this kind of storytelling because it uses the King in Yellow in the exact same way. Because when you take away the King in Yellow from that story, the cult is just a bunch of kind of gross killers and really nasty people. But when you add the horns and the drawings in the old churches and the people saying, "Have you seen Carcosa? Have you seen the yellow sign?" It takes this mystery up a notch that is absolutely incredible. And at the end of True Detective, I still don't know what the cult's about. I don't know what Carcosa is, and I don't know what the King in Yellow's about, and I don't want to because that's the power of the mystery. The expanse of this cult seems huge, but we only see these little peaks of insanity. It's really good, and I like the fact that the True Detective dealt with the concept of how working in those conditions would drive you insane, and I think it drives both of the detectives insane. And when you add the yellow sign, have you seen the yellow sign, which they ask continuously through True Detective, I think the yellow sign replaces the play of the King in Yellow in that thing you see, and once you see it, it drives you insane. And they've replaced, and that yellow sign is a metaphorical link to the violence that has been done to these poor, very innocent victims of this cult. It's really, really, really incredibly done, and I feel like a really wonderful nod back to this incredible, incredible book. I'm wrapping this up. Although I'm not finished talking about this book, there's a couple of horror stories in this that are not connected to the King in Yellow that I will go over, just because they're really good weird fiction and worth a read. Absolutely. And there's more Robert Chambers that's worth a read. This isn't the only weird fiction he wrote, but I'm wrapping it up because that's the end of the sections that have to deal with the King in Yellow. So I've really enjoyed this journey, starting with Bierce, and of course I've read Poe, and I know Poe inspired a lot of this weird fiction, and a lot of other writers have, but I liked picking one term, we'll say Carcosa, and figuring out where it first came from and traveling through weird fiction through that one term has been really, really enjoyable. So, yeah, you can expect me to talk about 3 more sections in this book, but this ends the sections on the King in Yellow. If you have more to say about this book, which I'm sure you do, and that's awesome, please do so in the comments. I love chatting with people in the comments. All right, if you liked this, please click like, and if you like this kind of content, please click subscribe, because we'll be making a lot more of it in the future. And thank you so much for watching.